welcome to this webinar. I'm Enrico Guarini, faculty member at the University of Milano Bicocca, and I'll be hosting today's event. We thank you for taking time to participate to this webinar. This educational webinar is entitled Governance Challenging in Setting Up and Running an ERIC. Today, I'll be joined by our guest speaker, Dr. Laurent Romary, Director General at DARIA ERIC, the Digital Research Infrastructure for the Arts and Humanities. This webinar is part of the Horizon 2020 ERI Train project, and it's also part of the Module 1 of the Executive Master in Management of Research Infrastructures, the modules of governance and organizations. Just a few details about this webinar. Today's agenda include a presentation from our guest speaker, and that will be followed by an interactive Q&A discussion with attendees to this webinar. So please to ask questions at the end of the presentation, use the raise hand icon that appears next to your name, and also use the Q&A box to ask any questions to our speaker throughout the webinar. Of course, the webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing, and we'll be sending out a link to view that recording in the coming weeks. Please also take note of our Twitter hashtag, ERITrain and Emory, and feel free to leave comments there. And also, you can also tag our speaker using his Twitter handle, Laurent Romary. Just a few words about Laurent. Laurent Romary, as I told you before, is Director General at DARIA and also Director of Research at INRIA in France. Laurent is Director in DARIA since 2011 when this research infrastructure were set up. And Laurent has a PhD degree in computational linguistics, and he carries out research on the modeling of semi-structured documents with a specific emphasis on texts and linguistics resources. He has also been active in standardizations activities with the ISO as chair of ISO committees and several committees on text encoding. He is also member and chair of its technical council. He also has a long-standing implication in open science-related activities. So in today's discussion, you will learn much about governance challenges in DARIA, and we'll leave with direct pointed changes that you can immediately implement in your organizations. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Laurent Romary presentations, and welcome, Laurent. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. This presentation is essentially based on my experience in setting up DARIA as an ERIC infrastructure over the years, and I'll try to focus on the difficulties, challenges, not necessarily providing answers to everything, but making sure that you're aware of the potential difficulties that one may have in organizing such a networked European-wide infrastructure. Yeah, it works. I present a brief history of DARIA. You've heard already a lot about DARIA when interacting with Jennifer Enmund a few days ago. I'll give a specific orientation towards our mission, and I will analyze how you can set up such an infrastructure from the point of view of the various stakeholders at whole level. I will also present how it is reflected in the DARIA organizational structure, and I speak about the overall challenges, and I would say with a final personal slide there. DARIA in short is bringing the traditional work of humanist scholars, that is to work on sources, primary sources, analyze them, trying to document their nature, trying to qualify, to identify the authorship, to assess the research value, and afterwards to enrich the corresponding source information by transcriptions, analyzing entities present in the manuscript. For instance, here an excerpt from the personal diary of a person who lived in Berlin in World War II. And at the end of the day, I would say at the end of the process, being able to communicate the result as, for instance, the transcription of the primary source, but also all aspects related to the analysis in traditional publication means. This research workflow in the digital world is exactly the main challenge for scholars now to understand, and this is what we're trying to solve or support from the point of view of DARIA. So the mission of DARIA is to enhance and support digitally enabled research and teaching also across the arts and humanities, with three main aspects here. Of course, there are some technological components like hosting data, for instance. There is an essential aspect about training researchers to deal with new digital methods. And of course, a third pillar is to inform about existing standards, existing best practices in the digital world for scholarly work. So one of the level of complexities for us, I would qualify DARIA as a knee infrastructure in a way, is to be a network not only of tools but also of information of people and methodologies. And those various aspects are disseminated, I would say fragmented across the various members that we have. And this is through this integration of national contributions in particular that we help communities to identify, for instance, that scholars have done something very similar to what they are intending to do at some point and can come to us to find out about this. A brief history of DARIA. Enrico mentioned 2011. It has started, as a matter of fact, in 2006. This is the year where we entered into the S3 roadmap at a time where S3 was actually being set up. So S3 is the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructures. It's basically the European body in charge of identifying priorities and setting up this roadmap of research infrastructures, which in turn is the basis for future funding, for instance. We had, like all research infrastructures, our preparatory phase at an early stage, and then we prepared for quite a long period, I would say between 2011 and 2014, the actual details of our infrastructure in terms of statutes, in terms of organization, in terms of priorities and membership, of course. So as you can see, it's quite a long story here, which reflects also the fact that if you know a little bit of the history of S3, it has started in 2005, we experimented a lot of aspects that were just being set up as we were moving along. For instance, the notion of an ERIC as an administrative structure. I come back to this. If we take a little distance from this historical perspective, setting up an ERIC is a long road based on three main steps. Basically, the fact that you belong to the S3 roadmap. This is a first application that you have to do, which is just judged at expert level, I would say, because the S3 roadmap corresponds to the level of granularity of working groups within S3. So in our case, the Socio and Cultural Innovation Working Group. But it already requires a strong political support, national support, of course, but also some kind of hints from the EU that acknowledges the existence of such a topic. For us, it was very difficult in a way, because it was the first time when DARIA came in and was accepted that there was something like an infrastructure in the humanities. Usually infrastructures are being considered for hard sciences and not so much for soft domains like the humanities. And this is part of the argumentations that we had to set up, that there is a need to support humanist scholars. Of course, once you're on the S3 roadmap, this is an important ticket because it opens the door to funding. Automatically, you've got some calls related to the so-called preparatory phase, where you can say, okay, I'm ready to apply for such a funding scheme. The second step is the submission process. This is a little bit more complicated. Again, we had to identify what the new ERIC status meant, but we built up our statutes and together with a scientific and technical case, and it has been reviewed by independent reviewers organized by the EU, this review process, until the ERIC is officially published on the EU official journal, which has been done in August 2014. And then somehow the ball comes back to the S3 group, which maintains existing infrastructures called landmarks in parallel to the ongoing roadmap of new infrastructures being set up. If I could summarize the core element of an ERIC, of course, it's important that there is a mission that reflects the needs of a scientific community. So like around the motto accompanying the digital turn in the humanities. It's even more important to have a consortium of states that reflect the national investments in the corresponding domain. And of course, during the setting up of an ERIC, the connection to the EU is very strong. Of course, the ERIC is being defined as a structure by the EU. It's an official legal structure. The EU is responsible for the initial creation process. Like I said, we were evaluated, assessed when we applied as an ERIC by the EU. And finally, the EU has the purse. The EU provides the funding schemes at the various stages of a research infrastructure. I would like to focus now more on the notion of member, because a consortium of states means that within Europe in particular, but not only, because an ERIC can be based on countries which are associated to Europe in a way or another. There are tiny details which we can discuss during the question and answer session, like the famous VAT exemption article. But from the point of view of building up an ERIC, you need to consider that you've got to address all types of EU members in size, small members like Malta we've had, or bigger members like France, Germany, Poland, or Italy. And a good member, whatever the size of the country, is articulated around the three items you see on the slide. Of course, you need a political will. You need to make sure that the corresponding country, at a, I would say at a high level in the ministries in particular, has an understanding of the need of the corresponding infrastructure in the national higher education and research landscape. It seems to be obvious, but it's not necessarily implemented in all countries. You've got very well organized countries, and you've got others for which when you come to them, it's the first time they think that they could participate, or at least at our time, they think that they could participate to such an infrastructure. The second important aspect is to make sure that the country is a little bit organized, that there is a real network of providers and users for the infrastructure. This is a basic condition for what I call irrigating a scholarly community. That you may have some leading research centers, you may identify some computing facilities in our case, also some existing service units. If there are some, like in some of our countries, in France with Humanum, in the Netherlands with DANS, that has provided services in the social and human sciences for years, for instance. And somehow, quite paradoxically, if you've got the two items here, it's not enough, or conversely, you would not get the first two items unless you've got a local champion. That is a person or a group of persons which feel specifically motivated in structuring the network within the country, and also knocking at the right doors at the ministry level. And usually the local champion cannot work alone. You need, as coordinator of the infrastructure, to basically go step by step and visit all the possible ministries and secretary of states. I think I've for a while I would be able to know any person in our core members between Serbia and Ireland, and shake as many hands as possible, because this is part of the game of setting up the ERIC here. The major challenge that you you face when you create such an ERIC is, of course, heterogeneity. Heterogeneity at various levels. Governance, there are countries like France and Germany or the Netherlands which have an official procedure to decide whether they would adhere to a new infrastructure or not. There are others where the decision is taken at random, and which is an issue in some domains, like we see now in the humanities, because when new infrastructures are coming in, the answer, in particular in smaller countries, is to say, look, we're already financing this infrastructure, we're not going to finance this other infrastructure. One other challenge is that there are some discrepancies in the actual ministry which may be in charge for the infrastructure. In our case, there's always a tension between Ministry of Research and Ministry of Culture, because dealing with humanities data is an interface with cultural heritage issues, for instance. The second reason of heterogeneity is the national capacity. There are various ways you see on the slide to see or to explain the membership for a given country, but basically we had some countries starting from scratch. I remember meeting Ivan Tazovac, the Ministry of Culture at that time in Serbia, who said, okay, we've got the National Archive, we've got the National Library in Serbia, we want to go digital, we want to be a member to DAIA to see in which direction we should be going to be more digital in our national cultural heritage institutions. Conversely, in the case of France, they already had some national infrastructures in place. I mentioned the Humanum service unit, and it was just in the continuity of what they already had. And for some countries, there was some kind of transition. So some well-established cultural heritage institutions that they wanted to extend to provide services, for instance, to research. The final object of heterogeneity are the funding schemes. I think this is a case for all domains where we've built up infrastructures in Europe in the last period. Basically, not all countries have a budget organization that allows a sustained funding of infrastructures at national level. In countries like Germany, until a recent period, and I know they're changing that currently, there is the idea that everything is project-based. So we've seen our counterpart in Germany of DAIA to be in the situation every 3 years. And if you think that it takes 6 months to prepare an application, it makes short periods in between. They had to apply for a new funding schemes and make sure that they would show they had new ideas, they would develop new tools. And basically infrastructures are not necessarily about new ideas, they are about stabilizing the provision of certain services. You had systems, I mentioned France several times already, which I know well, where the scheme exists already for continuous support, but with a low level of financing, basically. And you need to find constantly third-party service to develop new things, but you've got some stable financing in the background. And of course, there are mixed models, like in the Netherlands, where we've seen that our DAIA partners there around dance had some stable capacity, but had to make national applications on a regular basis to contribute to DAIA as a whole. Another important challenge is the situation of infrastructures with regards to the European Union. I would say I hope no one from the EU is here attending the webinar or listening now, but basically it's very important to see that there is a kind of contradiction with the fact that the EU plays a central role in establishing the ERICs. It sets the rule, it selects the infrastructures, it provides funded, but at the same time pays very little attention of what is being set up proper. So there is a constant tension, for instance, between the EU, the actual member states, and the communities themselves as to who is responsible for the long-term coherence in the research infrastructure landscape. I mentioned the case of new infrastructures being suggested in the humanities domain. It's true in other humanities. I think of biology, for instance, where somehow, depending on the funding schemes, the funds which are available, you may or may not have a new ID pop out, and no one is taking care that it articulates well with existing research infrastructures. There is also, of course, a lexical ambiguity with the notion of institution. For me, an ERIC is an institution, and the notion of a project. So you may have specific calls at the EU level, the so-called starting communities or the cluster calls, which speak of research infrastructures as projects. And you've got this tension again between the established research infrastructures and somehow the new groups of scholars being set up around those projects. And finally, I think it's important to consider that the EU remains disconnected with the actual developments that are taking place within the research infrastructures. There is, I mentioned, a little political involvement within the S3 work, but very little. So there's no political push to say, look, it would be good to work in a certain direction because we've already covered these and these topics. And basically, the way I analyze that is that ERICs are not seen as part of their instruments. They never come to us and say, look, you're here to provide those kinds of services, where as soon as we are created, we become responsible in front of the members and no more in front of the EU. This is exactly what is reflected in the organizational structure of an ERIC like DARIA. So basically, at the top of our bodies, we've got the General Assembly, which groups together national representatives. So it corresponds to the involvement of national governments within our ERIC. We've got the senior management team with three main bodies, I would say. The National Coordinator Committee, where you've got the national coordinators corresponding to the networks I was referring to before. The Joint Research Committee, which is actually working about the content, in particular integrating the national in-kind contributions to DARIA. And finally, the actual, I would say, administrative organization, which runs the day-to-day administration of the ERIC, the DARIA Coordination Office. Somehow on top of that, or parallel to that, you've got the board of directors, where we have 3 half-time positions held by scholars to actually somehow trace the route for the infrastructure as a whole. And when you look at our organigram, you see no room for the EU because within the NERIC, there's no relation at all established in the statutes. As a matter of fact, I'm lying a little bit. There is one paragraph saying that we've got to deliver an annual report to the EU once a year, and that's all, basically. The consequence from the point of view of DARIA, of this heterogeneity, the absence of relation to the EU, and those various levels of involvements, is that the decision process within a research infrastructure is a subtle combination of what we get from the communities, usually through the joint research community, the actual national expectations, with the difficulties we've seen in heterogeneous capacity levels, and the necessity also to integrate a global vision of priorities. And this is the essential role of the board of directors. I would analyze that as such, to actually not necessarily work, but think at the service of the infrastructure. And finally, funding opportunities. So this is where the EU is actually active. So each time there are EU calls, depending on the shape of those calls, we've got to adapt and put some of our priorities aside and favor some others because they fit the funding opportunities. This is probably one of the major aspects that people have to think about when they see this global organization and this decision process. That is, when do we need to have I would say, technical or administrative management of the research infrastructures, and when we should somehow take distance and think about the scientific priorities, which should always remain the source of any decision process. I'll come back to that in the conclusion. So the challenges from this for an ERIC, I mentioned a lot this term of heterogeneity. Um, um, the two main challenges in this category are the heterogeneity in political involvement. DIA is sometimes part of an existing national strategy, and sometimes it's just a line which has been identified in some budget. So some countries are paying every year without a real strategy of participating into the infrastructure or benefiting from the infrastructure. You've got, like I mentioned, heterogeneity in national capacity. We discovered that sometimes, and that's why I insisted so much on this, the weakness of the underlying network does not allow the country to be a real and active participant in the environment. And one, I would say, consequence of the two preceding aspects is the empowerment of the national coordinator. How much is he empowered by the ministry or by the fact that there is a well-organized network in the background to actually take decisions and contribute and integrate the national contributions to the research infrastructure. The other main challenge, which we are now facing after a few years of existence, is the turnover of personnel, of course. There is the risk of basically losing the political understanding at the national level. Why is the country involved in a given infrastructure? Because there is a loss of the memory of the system. And above all, when the local champion is being renewed or is going to other duties, you may have him or her replaced by someone who is just appointed and not so much motivated to contribute. So this is all these reasons makes me think that an essential aspect in thinking the organization of a research infrastructure should leave some space for the identification of some organizational memory mechanisms, so that you remember what arguments you've used for which country, how countries have prepared themselves to contribute to a research infrastructure, so that you can also come back to the country and say, look, this is your own history in a way when they've lost this trace. Okay, final thoughts. I think I'm just on time in the presentation here. From a more personal way, I've actually touched all the aspects I've been presented. I think I've never traveled so much as during the time we were preparing our ERIC application. And the role, I've discovered that the role of a president of the board of director or director general is and should not be an executive one. Basically, you need to choose a lazy director. This is the way I qualify myself. That is someone who takes time to think and is not always lost into the details. Although, obviously, when you create such a thing as an ERIC, and especially in the first months or years where the staffing is not complete, you may be in the situation of doing everything, basically. This is also why it's very important to have an efficient coordination office with a real specialist in budget affairs, in European project management, in legal affairs, so that things are running well at these levels and you can really focus on the scientific content. The three main aspects of a director general in this context are obvious, I think, but important to rephrase here. It's important to delegate, but it's a challenge because you need to know whether you need to delegate to countries, you need to delegate to specific scholars, you need to delegate to more administrative staff depending on the situation. So this is a real challenge. You need to take decisions quickly. There are decisions which have to be taken immediately before something is going into flames, I would say, in such an heterogeneous environment. And the main thing, again, is to keep contact with science. Most of the good decisions taken for DIA have come from the fact that they made sense from a scientific point of view, even if they were somehow hacks from an administrative point of view, from the EU regulation, from, I would say, the actual expectations related to our statutes. the scientific point of view should always be the leading one in a research infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laurent, for that presentation. It's really informative, and we're looking forward for receiving some questions coming from our audience.
I've got a question from Francisco and Ilaria.
Francisco, yes, just okay, Francisco.
Hello, thank you very much, Laurent, for the very nice and useful presentation. I have a question that I think you've almost answered, but it is relating with this challenge of the different response from the countries to the concept of an ERIC. So you mentioned the case of Germany or the Netherlands, in which the different countries can have different points of view about how to support the concept of ERICs, right? And now this is very interesting, not only for the ERICs that are being created, but even for the existing ERICs that are interested in getting new members. So would you think it interesting that the experience of the current ERICs that have some countries in their stakeholders portfolio could be shared and made available to the other ERICs that are fighting, let's say, with these countries? So in order to explain to them what the concept of the ERIC and what the different ways to integrating are.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been with Daria in the situation where we were more or less among the first ones to contact the corresponding ministries. We know better what's going on in the various countries, and I think it's very important to share experience. So, of course, I would say I would be eager to share with other ERICs being constituted and who have questions concerning specific countries. Let me just take an example as a warning somehow. We discovered that Denmark has a view of infrastructures which is very local in time, in the sense that they are ready to fund an ERIC for a certain number of years, but afterwards they expect that the national coordination will get their funding directly from the universities and not from a national fund. And if you're not warned, when you create the ERIC, you may come into difficulties there. And there are many things which are, I would say, not recorded, I would say in my memory from my my interactions with many countries, which we should probably share across ERICs and make a kind of catalog of things to be aware of, definitely.
That would be very, very, of course, many of us are involved in the ERIC forum, and many of us know that some of these questions will be addressed there.
Okay, thanks for answering that. We have another question from Pavel Odek. Pavel?
Hello, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I wanted to ask you about the heterogeneity of various, which appears in various countries. I think it may be quite challenging. So how do you try to orchestrate this? Because in this very changing landscape of various financing schemes and various preparedness for becoming, I don't want to say useful, but full eligible ERIC member, how do you cope with that? Do you provide to partners who are a little bit behind some kind of specific support, or how do you deal with that?
I think the main answer is a political one. I've visited the various countries. There is one common message I've always stated, which is it makes no sense to participate in the infrastructure if you don't know what you want to develop at the national level. So developing a national roadmap, developing national capacity, knowing what would be the priorities to serve your own researchers is an essential aspect before you even think of contributing to European infrastructure. If you come as a member and expect that the infrastructure will give everything to you without a national investment, the battle is lost in a way. And this is true for well advanced and less advanced countries in the corresponding field. That is, for less advanced countries, if there are some further steps that they've identified in which they want to invest, that's already a possible contribution.
Thank you.
Other questions? I've got a question from Christine Kubiak. Please, Christine.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you for the presentation that was really interesting. And just to follow on the previous question, because I think it's very interesting, this aspect, and I agree that sharing will be really helpful. I was just wondering whether there are some differences based on the area, because you may have also, as you mentioned, because it's really based on what is your national priority. So maybe then you will be a different answer based on the area, different from humanities, science, or I don't know, medicinal area. So I was just wondering this. And then I have another question related to your final slide and the role of the Director General, which is quite interesting. And in your case, because you have a board of directors, does it mean that you have different roles and you focus on one area, or how it is organized in your case?
Okay, two quite different questions, so I'll take one and the other. So concerning the domain dependence, I would say, I think Daria is a little bit extreme in the sense that more or less we started with no intention of building something central proper. That is, given that training is essential, given that there are a lot of aspects, I've not mentioned that, but related to national cultural heritage and language, for instance, the notion of national capacity is really an important aspect. We've got no sense of building a central equipment, for instance. Still, of course, we discover step by step that we need to provide some central services, but they remain virtual. I mean, technical from the point of view of a knee infrastructure, but virtual because they can be deployed at any place. So that impact, of course, I've compared that with other infrastructures in the S3 roadmap, when you know that you've got to make buildings, that you've got to build up some specific equipments which are then spread across Europe. Once you've identified where you put your emphasis and in which form, it's easier to count, for instance, the national participation. You can put a real budget behind that, but putting a real budget estimation of what it means to organize a certain summer school, to describe some standards and good practices in a domain, this is more difficult. And we've come, for instance, in this situation where we've gone away from the idea of in-kind as part of the budget to something which is more in-kind as deliveries to community. So what we say in-kind to out-kind somehow. Concerning the other question, depending on the area, I know there are different structures. So we've seen, we had a meeting yesterday with the other humanities infrastructure, Clarin, which has a larger board of directors with specific tasks. So a director in charge of communities, a director in charge of technical affairs, and so on and so forth. We've decided that we would have this board of directors with 3 part-time directors. We're all working 50% of our 200 persons, I would say. And there's no predefined task. We try to work as a collegial way as possible, and actually take up things on which we feel we can be more capable, I would say. With my experience, since I've been right from the beginning and since 2006 involved in Daria, as a matter of fact, I've got the background for the political discussions. I've got another director who is more in good terms, I would say, with the technical issues, and with working, for instance, on our marketplace currently, and colleague Jennifer was much better in organizing ideas and working on the strategy for Daria. But this is somehow random within our organization, and in the current situation, it proves to be working well. It works well because I think we do have a strong coordination office in the background. That is, the directors do not have to deal so much with more administrative issues.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? We have a question from Francisco and then from Ilaria. Please, Francisco.
Thanks for the second chance. You have mentioned about the VAT, and it looks like you want to talk about it. So please do, because it's sometimes a very complicated thing. I mean, what is it really with VAT that is your best, say, practice, or you can tell us your best advice about how to deal with it?
No, the point is that's very simple. So I mentioned that because basically, of course, for EU countries, we all live in the same acquis communautaire, as we know. But for non-EU countries, most of them, and it was the case, nearly the case for Serbia, have already set in place in their national legislation the conditions to participate in such a structure as an ERIC, except that, at least at the time where we initiated the process, not everyone had signed the ERIC agreement at European level, so that they had to show that they would be compatible with the ERIC principles. And one essential paragraph there was that ERICs could be exempted of VAT at European level. So a long process has been in existing non-EU countries that wanted to go into Daria to make sure that someone, usually at the Ministry of Budget or Ministry of Economy, would sign a paper acknowledging that they would fulfill those requirements for VAT exemption. That corresponds also, just to mention, to make a link to Christine's question before, we're in a situation where in the area of e-infrastructures, something like a VAT exemption does not make sense. So we never applied that. Arnaud, you tell me if I'm wrong. But there's no reason, because we don't buy big equipments for which we would claim a VAT exemption. So we just work in a normal way with normal invoices. It would be an overhead for us to actually implement such a VAT exemption facility. So just to mention that ERIC is a real official EU organization structure, and non-EU countries have to abide to the corresponding rules or mention that. So for most of the countries I've seen in the recent period, everything is in place. So there's no question with even Israel or similar countries. Of course, the accessing countries or countries like Norway are easy to integrate now in an ERIC.
Okay, thanks for answering that. We've got a number of questions. Please, Ilaria Nardello.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, hi. Thanks for the presentation, and sorry I came in a bit late. But I was wondering about economic activities, if you perform any.
No, because we don't have to sell services. That's what you mean. I mean, to sell participation. So we've tried to avoid that right from the beginning. So it's never on our plates. That's the short answer. The longer answer is that we're in a domain of information dissemination, where we try, on the contrary, to disseminate open science and open access ideas within our membership. So it would be difficult for us, on the one hand, to evangelize about open access and open science on the one hand, and to sell services on the other hand. And of course, in the humanities, we've got very little intersection with industrial needs proper.
Okay. Can I ask you another question? And it's related to the general director. And you showed in your slide that this is not an executive. So if the general director is not an executive, who is?
This is the, I mean, it's mentioned quickly in one of my slides. This is our chief.
Like the one before last or the last one.
Yeah, this is the chief executive officer. So we've got a person appointed full-time to actually coordinate the DCO and be the executive person in the organization.
Okay.
Yeah, there are so many definitions of what a board of directors is and whether it has an executive function or not. So it's really a matter of how it is implemented in the statutes.
So
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I was interested in this diversity. So your board of directors, does it correspond to the ministerial representatives?
No, they are the interlocutors to the ministries when necessary for political issues.
And do the representatives from the ministries ever convene together in an assembly, or are they just called onto issues by these board of directors?
No, by construction, the General Assembly is the General Assembly of representatives, so-called national representatives. So the General Assembly is the place which meets at least once a year. Usually we've got a face-to-face and a virtual one, 2 meetings per year.
Yeah.
And this is where, from our statutes, we are obliged to meet all representatives from ministries.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. Another question that's coming from Marcus Pasterk. Please, Marcus.
Well, thank you very much, Laurent, for your input. I had originally a comment, but as the discussion is ongoing, I also have a question. The comment is concerning VAT exemption, because I don't understand why you say you don't want to have the overheads of it. We also, as Bibimer, Eric, we don't buy equipment. But of course we're using the VAT exemption because it is there, and that saves us about 100,000 euros a year, which is quite an important amount of money. Mm-hmm. Now the question actually is around what we discussed a little bit earlier when I think Paco set up the notion: are different countries different in the attitude of applying an ERIC? And it's not actually that there is a difference between ERICs. It is even within one country it's different, because we deal both with science ministries as well as with health ministries in our own ERIC. Yeah. And in the countries the reaction is very different, and in some countries it's just the other way around. So I think what we need to do, and this is part of the ERIC forum we are currently setting up, is to have an understanding of which institution within the countries are, dealing positively or less positively with ERICs. And I'm happy that, also to mention that to the others, that this will be part of our work in the ERIC forum. So to give guidance not only to the newcomers, but also to the existing ERICs whenever they start negotiating with governments to get their countries on board. The question of board of directors is an interesting one, as you have a CEO who is not a director general, whereas the board of directors takes the executive function. Now, we have discussed that in Milano 2 weeks ago, and I think we understood the reasoning behind it. It is just, and for me, it's just an additional layer, which I understand you needed to serve your community, but for new ERICs, which should be set up, that might be a bit strange way how to set up a slim governance, because that's what you would think of. Is to have a rather slim governance structure, but here you show a very a very complicated, very detailed, which is working in your case, but might not be the best model to show.
Yeah, I'm answering immediately the third point, which is an interesting one. This is one of the consequences of being among the first ones to be set up as an ERIC. You need to look at the Daria statutes and imagine that the initial draft was probably 3 times as thick as the one we had now. So we made somehow the mistake initially during our preparatory phase to hire a jurist who actually thought of all the possibilities and the details and the possible organizational hacks that we may encounter. And we had some unapplicable statutes at the beginning. And the complexity, I think, of our global organization relates to this history of imagining what an ERIC statute could be without any real example at hand. Even the Commission didn't know exactly how to react on our first draft because they had no experience concerning this. So there would probably be possibilities to optimize, to simplify our organizational structures, except that it would mean paying specific effort to this rather than to the content, and there is a real trade-off here. Concerning the variety of ministries, so I'm glad to hear that we were not the only one to sometimes even have difficulties in identifying whether it's the Ministry of Research, the Ministry of Culture, in your case the Ministry of Health. Think also that the Ministry of Budget was always behind the scene and checking everything. So we've had a lot of so-called navette in French. So the file going from one ministry to the others until we identified where it was blocked for decision. So that was an interesting thing. And finally, concerning VAT exemption, as an infrastructure and decentralized one, we actually spend most of our budget in personnel, and most of this personnel are seconded in institutions. That is, we do not hire anyone for the time being ourselves, and we've got very little real things we need to buy and for which we would need to claim VAT exemption. So that's why it has never been, I mean, that's why we see that as an overhead in our situation.
Thanks, Laurent. We've gotten a question here from Simone Campana. Please, Simone. Simone, are you there? No, I think it seems Simone is not connected now. Okay. Just a question for you, Laurent. You mentioned about the challenges related to the heterogeneity, and especially for the political will, which is different in different countries. So this is a relevant challenge in setting up a new research infrastructure. But I wonder if once you have established a governance structure, political terms imply that there is a turnover maybe every 5 years or maybe less. And so you can have also experience a loss of memories, difficulties in finding the appointing of new local champions, as you mentioned. So how do you deal with these ongoing challenges, or even if once you have established the governance structures?
Sometimes you've got the feeling that you need to start again from scratch. That somehow, but it's easier because you know through which gates you have to do. But yes, you need to go, for instance, once again up to the level where you reach, let's say, the Secretary of State. Sometimes we've got new members, which seems to be, we've got members where the change of personnel seems to be well identified, established. I'm not giving names here, but I've got a specific example in mind. But then we discovered that the new people appointed as representative of the ministry and national coordinator are just been appointed, I would say, by accident, and they do not reply anymore to any kind of contact. And we need really to knock at the doors before we get an effective feedback. So there are real difficulties here, and sometimes it's like, yeah, starting from scratch with a new member when the renewal process is a little bit too heavy.
We could say that a peculiarity of governance mechanism in research infrastructures is processes. It's not part of the structure itself.
Yeah, it's a process of constantly keeping a communication channel with the members and also with the EU. So to make people aware of what's going on, of the progress we make, and so on.
Thank you for this point. Let me see if there are any.
Enrico, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, this is Simone. I had a problem with the microphone. Can I ask the question?
Yes, I think it's the last one.
Thanks. I wanted to go back a second to the point raised by Francisco, the first one. So you said about heterogeneity and the fact that you have different kind of participation, big countries, small countries. Does it happen at any point that, particularly considering newcomers, you feel that the participation of some country might be more work than benefit? And is there a mechanism, official or non-official, to deal with that?
So the answer is yes. This is really the case, in particular for smaller countries, which are seeing their participation into the infrastructure as a kind of way of getting more visibility, and which may be more demanding in average than countries for whom participation is just an obvious continuation of a national development. So it's more difficult because we're recorded to give names, but yes, I've got a couple of smaller countries which have taken a lot of energy without not so much return on investment. And since I mentioned Serbia, it's not Serbia because Serbia has been very active in our environment at the end of the day. So this is a real issue, and no, we don't have any mechanism. Because we need to be fair in our organization, but I think this is essential to have processes in the statutes, but I guess we are all aware of that. I mean, if some of you are involved in setting up statutes at present, to make sure that you do not base all decision processes on a simple majority, but a qualified majority where the proportion of budget is taken into account. That, for instance, decisions are taken by at least 50% of the budget and things like this. So this is part of the mechanisms that you can implement in your statutes.
Okay, thank you, Laurent, for this answer. And also, I think the time is expired. It's been a really terrific our presentation and discussion with you, and that's all the time we have, fortunately, for the questions today. So, okay, thanks so much, everyone, for attending this webinars. Also, of course, thank you to Laurent. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great day. See you in the next webinar.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Okay, Laura, I think you've raised very interesting issues. The issues, very important challenges for.
I hope it was in phase with what you expected. I don't have the overview of the modules. So.
Yeah. Because now it's the module is completed after your webinar, and now you are going to assign an assignment to each of them, and so they will have time to reflect on the input that you have provided also with your webinar, the last one in module 1, and we'll leave participants some time to reflect on the assignment, governance organizations, and reflect a little bit. So it's time to say hello to everybody. thank you so much again, Laurent, for your time, sharing your knowledge. I expect to involve you again in the next month, maybe. We invite you to come in Milan, of course.
Okay. Bye-bye then.
Bye-bye. Is anything else? We have finished the webinar, of course, and the recording is finished. So I can say hello to everybody, and let's keep in touch, because now we are, as I told before, going to make an assignment on Module 1 and complete it within a month. So thank you again. Have a weekend also to you, Laurent. Bye-bye.